Hey everyone, welcome back. Now we are going to deal with the subtopic of class 10 7th chapter, that is outcomes of democracy, and that subtopic is economic outcomes of democracy. Now we are going to deal with the economic outcomes that we often have from democracy. Okay, so let's go and have a look at this. So economic growth and development. So what happened between 1950s and 2000? Dictatorship have a slightly higher rate of economic growth. However, we must understand that these differences are negligible. Let's take an example, like economic growth is tend to be accepted as in dictatorships or dictator authoritarian form of a government. What happens? They have a higher rate of economic growth in comparison to a democratic form of a government. However, we must understand it very nicely that this difference is very negligible. It is very it is barely visible if you talk about it. So dictatorship have slightly higher rate of economic growth than the democracy. So that difference in the rate of economic development between the less developed countries with dictatorships or democracy is negligible if we talk about it in terms of less developed countries. Okay, that difference is negligible. So overall, we cannot say that democracy is a guarantee to economic development. We cannot say it like that. Democracy may or may not, it is not a guarantee to economic development. Okay. However, we can at least expect this from democracy, that it will not lag behind the dictatorship in any respect. As we can see that topmost in terms of GDP, that was USA is in the topmost country in terms of GDP per year if we talk about, and that is a democratic form of a country, right? But if you take an example of less developed countries with democratic or dictatorship form of a government, the difference will be very negligible or very less. Okay, so we must understand it that even it may be possible that dictatorship might have a slightly higher rate of economic growth, but in less developed countries that difference would be negligible. Okay, let's move ahead. So the economic inequalities within the countries face various economic inequalities. The thing is that one particular section is very rich, one particular section is really poor. There is basically economic inequalities, and if we talk about it, there is particularly a gap. If it is, think about it, the rich are very rich and the poor are very poor. So that's how we have a gap between them, and that it is widening day by day. So as we can see, that should the gains of economic growth can be evenly distributed, how can the poor get a voice for a better share in a nation? If we talk about it like that, economic development is not always equally distributed. The one thing that we need to understand it is not always economic development is not always equally distributed. Okay, so the rich may grow richer while the poor remain poor, or even worse could happen. Okay, so widening the gap between them, the rich always benefit more than in terms of growth in economy than the poor do from the same economic growth. So how can the poor get the voice for a better share in a nation? It's just in a nation. It's just that they have to. So in order for the poor to be heard, they need what? They need representation through NGOs. If we talk about it, how the poor can get their voice in and their share within the nation, they require NGOs. They need representatives or someone who could help them out in this. Political leaders, counselors. Okay. So these prominent people will what? They will stand as leaders and will represent the poor in order to express their views or their views to the government. As we have studied before as well, right? The political leaders act as a very good medium in terms of conveying the needs of the people. And the people have the right, they can change their representative in the next session as well, the next tenure, if they don't like them. So that's how they try to get their representation through NGOs, political leaders, counselors, and many prominent people, so that they could attract their the attention of the government in terms of hearing their needs or demands. Okay, so that's how the economic inequalities in the country exist, and they also have situation where the gap between the rich and the poor widens in a democratic form of a government. Like in democratic form of a government, it doesn't happen in a communist one, because almost everyone has because similarity within all like basic things. They have the basic things. But in a democratic form of a government, that is capitalism, a capitalist form of a country, what happens? It is there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and it widens with because in any form of economic growth, the rich have get benefited really well in comparison to the poor one. So that's how these are differences, and these leads to economic inequalities within the countries. Okay, moving further, the economic inequalities within country. So the thing is, in democratic countries like South Africa, Brazil, the top 20% people of the people like take away around 60% of national income. There is also an inequality of opportunities. If we talk about, there are like 60% of the people take the national income, and there is inequality of opportunities available to the poor in the democratic countries. So it's not just like to have a democratic form of government, we will have economic development as well, individual basis. The thing is, in democratic form of a government, there is one thing that's like 60% of the people have the national income. Like 20% of the people take more than 60% of the national income, and there are inequalities of opportunities in terms of poor in the democratic countries. It is very difficult for them because to have the housing, healthcare, schooling, and they have to suffer from hunger as well. As we can see here, my goodness, little fella, how far did you fall down? These are the poor kids which has been represented in this cartoon, if we talk about it. Because it is not the similar case in the communist type of a country, because where basic needs are provided by the government, education, health facilities, schooling, and food facilities. These are basic things are provided by the government only. But this is not the case in the democratic form of a government. It is quite different. Democratical capitalism, capitalist form of a country, right? It is different. That's why economic inequalities are faced by the poor in the democratic form of countries. Okay, so that hence we can say that these are economic inequalities that we often see in democratic form of government. However, we must understand it that in less developed countries, the difference between a democratic form of government or a authoritarian dictatorship, there is not a huge difference. There are like the difference is highly negligible if we think about it. So, and on other matters in terms of what democracy provides, political equality and other stuff. So we can say that democracy doesn't lag behind in any way. It's just that the basic things and they have to suffer a little bit of inequality of opportunities, and gap between the rich and the poor exists. That keeps on widening with the economic growth, as rich benefits better in comparison to the poor one in a democratic form of a country. Okay. So the thing is the reduction of inequality and poverty. If we talk about, the democracies are based on political equality, as I have stated before. They provide political equality in terms of voting rights or representation or anything. They provide political equality. A large proportion of people remain poor despite this economic equality or growth and development. Yet, governments do not appear to keen interest in address the questions of the poverty. The thing is, the democracies are basically, they provide political equality. However, they at times neglect the income inequality that suffer. The people have to suffer it in a democratic form of a country, because the large section of the people remains poor despite the economic growth and development. However, the government they are like not that interested in this, because obviously they wanted to remain in power, and for that the rich people, they try to basically they try to make the rich people by their side in every sort of a way. However, the poor section is huge, but they get the benefit from the rich people, right? So that's how even after having political equality, there are chances because we have economic inequality and poverty within our country. Democratic form of government have to rely to the rich people of their country in order to survive, because they have to address the questions of poverty, which is very difficult for them to handle it alone. Hence, they have to rely on the rich section. That's why they cannot ignore the risk section, obviously, and somehow they are not able to address the issue of economic inequality which are being suffered by the poor section of the society. So that's why we in democratic form of a country we face inequality and poverty at a very large scale. However, the democratic form of government, they maintain political equality, but economic inequality prevails there. Okay, because a large proportion of the people remain poor despite the economic growth or development. However, the government are not able to address the question of poverty in those areas, or are unable to address it. Okay, so till this we have learned about the economic inequalities that the democratic form of a country have to suffer. Okay, in the next we will talk about the social differences, diversity in the various democracy. We'll talk about the dignity and everything. Okay, till then, bye bye.